Abraham. From idolater to covenant father. Ancient path of life. Before Abraham became the father of faith, he came from a house where other gods were served. That is not a metaphor. That is not a poetic introduction. It is a biblical fact, recorded plainly in the book of Joshua, where God himself reminded the people of Israel exactly where their story began. The words are striking. God said, "Your ancestors lived beyond the Euphrates River, and they worshipped other gods." And then he named Terah, the father of Abraham. The father of the man the whole world now associates with faith, covenant and divine promise. Pause on that for a moment. The man we call the father of faith was raised in a household shaped by idolatry. His family, his community, his entire cultural world, it was all built around gods that were not the living God. The system he was born into was not a system of covenant. It was a system of inherited religion, shaped by human hands, human traditions and human fears. And yet, out of that very world, God chose to call one man. To separate him. To reorder his life. To covenant with him. And through that one act of divine governance, the entire trajectory of human history was altered. Now here is what makes Abraham's story so layered, and why it still matters today. Most people think of Abraham as a man who simply had faith. A man who received a promise. A man who walked with God from the beginning. But the biblical record tells a far more complex and far more interesting story. Abraham did not begin as the finished article. He began as Abram, a man formed by a world God had to call him out of. A man shaped by systems God had to separate him from. A man whose very identity God eventually had to rename. This is not just the story of one ancient patriarch. This is a pattern. A divine pattern that runs through scripture and through human history. The pattern of how God governs a person into purpose. The pattern of what it costs to leave the familiar. The pattern of what happens when a human being hears the voice of the living God, not as a cultural tradition, not as an inherited belief system, but as a direct, personal, life-reordering call. Abraham's journey from idolatry to covenant is the story of a life that was regoverned. And the reason it still matters, thousands of years later, is because many people today are in the same position Abram was in before the call came. Shaped by systems they did not choose. Loyal to patterns they inherited. Living in a familiar place that God has been quietly asking them to leave. Stay with this. Because by the end of this episode, you are not just going to know more about Abraham. You are going to see the ancient pattern that governs destiny, and you may recognize it in your own life. Welcome to Ancient Path of Life, where we uncover biblical stories, ancient patterns and divine principles for a governed life. If this is your first time here, take a moment to subscribe. We go deep into scripture to find not just history, but the wisdom that governs a purposeful life. To understand what God was doing when he called Abram, we have to understand what Abram was before the call. The biblical record begins his story in Genesis chapter 11. We are introduced to a man named Terah, who lived in a city called Ur of the Chaldeans. Terah had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor and Haran. Haran died before his father, leaving behind a son named Lot. At some point, Terah decided to take his family and travel toward the land of Canaan. But they never made it. They stopped in a place called Haran, a city that shares its name with Terah's dead son, and they settled there. And Terah died in Haran at the age of 205 years. A family in motion, but a family that stopped short. A family carrying loss. A family that paused in a halfway place and called it home. Now, what does Joshua 24 tell us about this family? It tells us that Terah served other gods. The text does not elaborate on which gods or in what manner. It simply states the fact plainly. Terah and his household were part of a world that worshipped gods who were not the God of Israel. The city of Ur was a deeply religious city, a major center of worship for the Sumerian moon god Nana. Terah's world was not secular or spiritually empty. It was full of religion, full of ritual, full of devotion. but devoted to gods made by the hands and imaginations of men. This matters enormously when we try to understand the weight of God's call to Abram. Abram did not grow up in a spiritual vacuum. He grew up in a world with a fully formed religious system, temples, traditions, rituals passed down through generations, cultural answers to the deepest human questions about the cosmos, about the divine, about death and meaning and order. Those answers existed in his world. They were not the right answers. But they were the answers he was surrounded by. When God called Abram, he was not calling a man with no spiritual framework. He was calling a man who had inherited a spiritual framework that needed to be replaced entirely. And that speaks directly to the experience of many people today. Very few come to God from a place of total spiritual emptiness. Most come from somewhere, with inherited beliefs absorbed from family, culture and tradition, beliefs that have been quietly shaping them for years before a genuine encounter with the living God begins to challenge and reorder them. Terah had started moving toward Canaan. But he stopped in Haran and stayed. Sometimes the weight of loss and the comfort of familiar surroundings cause people to settle in a halfway place and never complete the journey. Terah did not finish it. Abram, his son, would be asked to finish it, and to go further than his father ever intended. That is how this story begins. Not with perfection. It begins with a man formed by a flawed world, living in a halfway city, carrying the shadow of his family's idolatry and his father's incomplete journey. And God called him anyway. That alone should tell us something about how God works. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. The words are direct and their weight is impossible to overstate. God said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." 3 things. Country. Kindred. Father's house. Notice what God did not say. He did not say, "Think about going." He did not say, "When you are ready." He said, "Go." And then he listed, with great precision, the 3 layers of the old life that Abram was being called to leave behind. This is not a travel itinerary. This is a governance instruction. Country. In the ancient Near East, your country was not merely a geographical location. It was a cultural identity, the place that told you who you were, where you belonged, what gods were worshipped, what systems governed life. Was that for Abram. The world that had formed him. The soil out of which his sense of self had grown. And God said, "Leave it." Kindred. The extended family, the clan, the tribe, the network that provided social identity, protection and belonging. To leave your kindred was to leave your entire social structure. The people who knew your name, shared your history, carried the same bloodlines. These relationships were not just emotional, they were structural. They gave a person stability, status and security. And God said, "Leave them." Father's house. The most intimate layer. The immediate household. The place where Abram had sat at Terah's table, where the family gods had likely been kept, where the rituals of the household had been formed and passed down. The center of spiritual and cultural inheritance. Where the deepest formation happened. And God said, "Leave it." 3 concentric circles of the life that had been governing Abram up to that point. And God called him out of all 3. God was not simply telling Abram to move to a new location. He was dismantling the entire architecture of the old government. Separating Abram from every system, cultural, social, familial and spiritual, that had been shaping him. Deconstructing the old government of his life so that a new government could be built in its place. When God is about to build something new through a person, he often begins by challenging what has been governing that person. Not because the old life is always evil in every way. But because the new thing God is doing requires a new foundation. And a person cannot lay a new foundation while standing firmly on the old one. At some point, a genuine transition requires a genuine leaving. There is a cost to that. We should not pretend there is not. When Abram walked out of Haran, he was walking away from everything familiar. Everything known. everything that had given his life its shape. He was not walking toward a clear map or a defined destination. He was walking toward a promise, spoken by a voice he had chosen to believe. That takes a particular kind of courage. And it takes more than courage, it takes a decision about which voice governs you. The world Abram was leaving had a voice. Culture has a voice. Family has a voice. Familiarity has a voice. All of these voices speak constantly in the language of comfort, safety, and reason. Why leave? What if this does not work? Who will you be without this? Abram heard another voice. And he chose to let that voice govern his movement. He was 75 years old when he left. 75. That is not a young man in the middle of his restless searching years. That is a man who has lived a life, built a world, settled into rhythms. And God called him out of it all. Pause here and consider this. What familiar system would be hardest for you to leave if obedience required it? Verse 4 of Genesis 12 contains 5 of the most significant words in the entire story. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him. He went. Something happened in that departure that goes deeper than geography. When Abram left Ur, then left Haran, then began walking toward a land God had not yet named for him, he was not just changing his address. He was changing his spiritual government. Moving from a world of gods made by human hands to the voice of a living God who spoke, promised, commanded and covenanted. From inherited religion to living relationship. From the government of his fathers to the government of the Most High. Inherited religion is not the same as a living relationship with God. Inherited religion can look exactly like faith from the outside. It attends the right gatherings, uses the right language, performs the right rituals. A person can genuinely believe they are faithful while operating entirely within a system they have never personally examined, never personally tested, never personally surrendered to. Terah's household had that kind of system. They knew what gods required. The rituals, the traditions, the cultural forms, the system functioned. But it was built around gods who were, in the end, projections of human desire and human fear. Gods who did not call, did not promise, did not covenant and did not reorder the lives of those who encountered them. The God who spoke to Abram was different in kind, not just in degree. The God who spoke to Abram was different in kind, not just in degree. A God who spoke in the first person. Who called by name. Who said go and expected obedience. Who tied his promises to real history, real geography, real descendants and real time. Who did not merely want to be worshipped, he wanted to be known. The gods of Ur did not call people out of their homeland. They were of the homeland, expressions of the culture, guardians of the city, powers that kept things as they were. But the God of Abram called him to move. And in moving, to become something the old system could never have produced. This is where faith becomes governance, not merely belief. Faith, in the biblical understanding, is not a private conviction held quietly in the mind. In the life of Abraham, faith is demonstrated through movement. It is what governs the direction of a life, where a person goes, what they leave behind, what they obey, what they release. The old systems do not simply disappear the moment a person decides to follow God. They linger. They whisper in the language of the familiar. They question the new direction in the name of reason and caution. The old system has roots, and those roots do not let go without a genuine act of will and continued obedience over time. Abram did not become Abraham overnight. But the trajectory held. The obedience deepened. The relationship grew more personal, more tested and more real. Faith is not only what you believe privately. Faith is what you allow to govern your movement, your decisions, and your obedience. There is something specific about the way God issued the original call to Abram that is easy to read past if we are not paying attention. God said, "Go to the land that I will show you." Not, "Go to the land of Canaan." He said, "Go to the land I will show you." Future tense. Progressive revelation. The destination was not named up front. The full picture was not given before Abram took the first step. This is not an administrative oversight. It is a divine design. The ancient path of faith is characterized by sufficient light for the next step, not a floodlit map of the entire road. If Abram had received a detailed itinerary, every challenge predicted, every year of waiting marked on a timeline, it would have required a very different kind of trust. It would, in some ways, have required less trust, because the walk would have been fully mapped in advance. But God was not building a relationship that functioned only in the presence of complete information. He was building a relationship that held when the information ran out. He was developing a person who could say, as Abraham would eventually demonstrate, "I know the God who promised, and he is faithful," not because the circumstances made it obvious, but because the history of walking with that God had proven it again and again. The discipline of walking without full details is one of the most practically challenging aspects of living by faith. And it is one that modern life actively resists. We live in an age of information, more data, more analysis, more planning tools than any generation before us. In many areas of life, that is genuinely useful. But there is a spiritual dimension of the journey that information cannot fully map. There are decisions God calls a person to make before the full picture is visible. Steps of obedience that precede complete understanding. Seasons where the instruction is clear but the outcome is not yet revealed, and the call is to move anyway. Many people want full certainty before obedience. They want the entire road visible before they take the first step. But biblical faith, as modeled in Abraham's life, includes the capacity to move at God's instruction when the road ahead is not yet fully visible. The promise God made to Abram was extraordinary: a great nation, a great name, blessing to all the families of the earth. But when Abram walked out of Haran, none of that was visible. The only evidence he had was the word of a God he had just begun to know. And he walked. Here's a question worth carrying: have you ever had to obey God without knowing exactly how everything would work out? The step taken before the path was fully clear. The decision that required trust rather than certainty. This is not unusual in the life of faith. It is characteristic of it. After the departure. After the walking. After the seasons of travel and arrival and building altars and moving again. After the famine that drove Abram to Egypt and the missteps that came with it. After the separation from Lot and the battles and the strange encounter with Melchizedek, after all of that, God spoke again. Genesis 15. Abram is older now. He has been walking with God for some time. And he has a question. A deeply human question. God has promised him descendants as numerous as the stars. But Sarai has not conceived. And Abram says to God, plainly and honestly, "You have given me no offspring." He points to the night sky and the reality of an empty house and asks, what exactly is this promise, and how exactly is it going to work? God answered. Not with a rebuke for asking. He answered by taking Abram outside and showing him the stars. "So shall your offspring be." And Abram believed. And God counted it to him as righteousness. This moment, this simple act of believing what God said, even when visible reality did not yet confirm it, is the moment Paul, writing in Romans, returns to when he wants to explain what faith actually means. Abram believed God. That willingness to take God at his word against the evidence of empty years, that was counted as righteousness. Not a performance. Not a completed record of moral achievement. The belief itself. But God did not stop there. God made a covenant with Abram. And this is where the story moves from promise to structure. A covenant in the ancient world was not merely a verbal agreement. It was a binding, structured, spiritually serious act, involving sacrifice, ritual, and witnesses. It created a relationship with defined terms, mutual obligations, and permanent standing. When God covenanted with Abram in Genesis 15, walking between the pieces of the sacrificed animals as a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, he was establishing a formal, binding divine structure over Abram's life and destiny. Covenant gave structure to promise. Before the covenant, Abram had a promise and a call. After the covenant, he had a framework of divine relationship, divine obligation and divine purpose that would govern his life and the lives of his descendants from that point forward. God does not govern through vague, unstructured inspiration. He covenants. He structures. He defines. He makes formal what he intends to fulfill. The covenant with Abraham was not a motivational speech. It was a divine framework through which God would work in history to accomplish his purposes through a specific line of people. Then came Genesis 17. Abram was 99 years old. God appeared and said, "Walk before me, and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you." And then, in the middle of this covenant renewal, God changed his name. Abram became Abraham. This is not a minor administrative detail. In the ancient world, names carried identity, destiny and meaning. To change a name was to redefine who a person was before God, before others, and before themselves. Abram means, exalted father. Abraham means, father of a multitude. God renamed him not according to what he currently was, an old man with no heir, but according to what the covenant declared he would become. Every time someone called his name, they were speaking the promise aloud. His very name became a daily reminder of the divine structure that now governed his life. Before God uses a person to carry generational promise, he redefines identity. The pattern holds beyond Abraham. Simon became Peter. Saul became Paul. Before the assignment was fully released, identity was reordered. What a person believes about who they are governs what they do, what they dare and what they tolerate. A life reordered by covenant begins to operate from an entirely different framework. Abraham's covenant was not only about land and descendants. It was about the structure of divine governance entering a human life and a human lineage in a way that would shape the entire future of redemptive history. That is the weight of what God was building through one man's obedience. It would be a distortion of Abraham's story to present it as a smooth, unbroken ascent from the call to the covenant to the fulfillment of promise. The biblical record does not present it that way. And we should not either. Abraham's journey had a cost. A texture of process, difficulty and imperfection. Acknowledging that honestly is not a diminishment of his faith, it is part of what makes his story so deeply human and so deeply relevant. He left Haran and arrived in Canaan, only to find a famine. He went down to Egypt to survive, and in Egypt, afraid of what Pharaoh might do, he asked Sarai to present herself as only his sister. A half-truth rooted in fear. It placed Sarai in a position of risk and revealed that the man of faith was also capable of operating from the old system of self-preservation when fear was strong enough. The same pattern repeated later with Abimelech. The man who had walked away from his entire world at God's command still carried within him the capacity to shrink back into human calculation when the stakes felt too personal. He waited decades for the promised child. Years of silence. An aging body and a wife who laughed, quietly, to herself, at the thought that such a thing could still happen. In those waiting years, Abraham and Sarah attempted to solve the problem themselves. Hagar. Ishmael. A human plan to fulfill a divine promise on a human timeline. And while God treated Hagar and Ishmael with dignity and compassion, the plan created pain that echoed for generations. Abraham was not a perfect man. And yet, God did not revoke the covenant because Abraham had failed to execute it flawlessly. He kept appearing. He kept speaking. He kept shaping. He kept moving the story forward. God does not call perfect people. He governs yielded people. The distinction matters. Perfection is a standard of flawless performance. Yieldedness is a posture of continued openness, a willingness to return, to keep walking, to keep obeying even after failure. Abraham was not perfect. But he was yielded. When God spoke, he listened. When God called, he moved. When God tested him, in the most severe test of his life, with Isaac on the mountain, he obeyed even when obedience was devastating to contemplate. That yieldedness, cultivated over decades of real and costly process, is what allowed God to keep forming him into the man the covenant required. The cost of becoming a covenant father was not just leaving Haran at the beginning. It was every subsequent act of obedience in the face of unanswered questions, long silences and tests that seemed to contradict the very promise God had made. It was the cost of a long walk rather than a short trip. And maybe this is where Abraham's story becomes personal. Which part of his journey speaks most to you, the leaving, the waiting, the trusting, or being renamed? Abraham's story contains all of these seasons. Some people reading this are in the leaving, God is calling them out of something, and the cost is real and present. Some are in the waiting, the promise has been spoken but the fulfillment is not yet visible. Some are in the trusting, in the middle of a test that seems to contradict what they were told. And some are being renamed, God is redefining who they are in ways that feel unfamiliar and not yet fully inhabited. So what do we do with all of this? What does a man who lived 4,000 years ago have to say to a person navigating life in the 21st century, in a city, with a career, with a family, with a phone in their pocket and a world that looks nothing like a desert road between Haran and Canaan? More than you might think. Because the pattern is not cultural. Not geographical. It is divine, and divine patterns do not expire with the era they were first displayed in. Abraham's story reveals how God governs a person into purpose. And it follows a sequence worth naming plainly. God calls. A divine initiative, a moment when the living God addresses a human life directly, cutting across the inherited systems and comfortable arrangements that have been governing it up to that point. God separates. The call almost always involves a genuine departure, not always a physical relocation, but a leaving of something. An old identity. An old system. An old loyalty. The separation is not punitive. It is structural. The new thing God is building cannot be built on the old foundation. God speaks. Into the uncomfortable space between the old life and the new one, God speaks. Not always immediately. Not always clearly. But consistently and faithfully over time. God covenants. God does not merely inspire. He structures. He binds himself to his purposes. When God covenants with a person's life, that purpose is held in place not by the person's flawless performance but by the faithfulness of the one who made the covenant. God renames. Before the full assignment is released, identity is reordered. The old name, shaped by the old system, the old limitations, the old voices, gives way to a name aligned with divine purpose. God forms a person for generational purpose. The goal is always larger than the individual. Through the yielded life, God builds something that outlasts that person, a current of purpose, character and divine pattern that flows into the generations that follow. Now here is the question the pattern raises: what old mindsets still govern you? What inherited patterns still shape your decisions without you fully examining them? What familiar place has God been asking you to leave? What promise is waiting on the other side of an obedience you have not yet made? Many people want the promise without the separation. The destiny without the discipline. The blessing without the new government. But Abraham's life reveals that the promise and the separation are not separate stages, they are deeply connected. The separation is not a detour from the path. It is the path. The ancient road is not nostalgic romanticism. It is the divine pattern, as old as Abraham and as present as today, for a life governed not by inherited systems and cultural default but by the voice, the covenant and the purpose of the living God. Take a moment to consider what this story is actually asking of you. Not as a religious exercise. Not as a theological review. But as a genuine act of self-examination before the God who called Abraham out of Haran and is, perhaps, calling you out of something as well. What governs my choices? Not what do I believe, but what actually governs the decisions I make day to day. What voice carries the most weight? What inherited pattern shows up most consistently in how you respond to fear, uncertainty, and opportunity? What voice do I obey first? Abraham's transformation was not primarily about geography, it was about authority. Whose voice became the governing authority of his life? And in your life, when the voice of God and the voice of the familiar system say different things, which one moves you? What familiar system am I still loyal to? Not all inherited patterns are harmful. But some of them, often the deepest and most comfortable ones, are the very things limiting what God is trying to build. The hardest systems to leave are not the obviously broken ones. They are the comfortable ones. The ones that still mostly work. The ones that ask very little of you in return for keeping you exactly where you are. What identity has God spoken that I have not yet fully embraced? Many people have received a new name, a covenant word about who they are and what they are called to carry, but they still introduce themselves by the old one. Still make decisions from the old framework. The new name must be inhabited. Lived from, not just believed about. What ancient path is God calling me back to? Not nostalgia for a simpler era. The ancient path is the path of the governed life, ordered by divine wisdom, shaped by covenant relationship, disciplined by obedience and directed toward a purpose larger than personal comfort or cultural approval. These are not questions with quick answers. They are questions worth carrying, into a quiet morning, into a season of prayer, into a conversation with someone who knows you well and loves you enough to tell you the truth. Abraham's story is not simply the story of a man who received a remarkable promise. It is the story of a man God called out of one government and brought under another. From the house of Terah, where other gods were served, to the covenant of the Most High. From Ur to Haran to Canaan to Moriah. From Abram to Abraham. From the inherited system to the living relationship. From the idol-shaped world to the covenant-shaped life. And in all of that, in the leaving, the waiting, the failing, the trusting, the renaming and the forming, there is a pattern that belongs not just to one ancient man but to every person who has ever heard a call that required them to leave something familiar behind. The ancient path is not a road you travel by looking backward. It has always moved forward, toward the purposes of a God who calls, covenants, renames and forms people for destinies that outlast their own lifetimes. Abraham obeyed. And in that obedience, something was released into history that is still moving today. The question is what will be released through yours. If this episode helped you see Abraham differently, not just as a distant figure of religious history, but as the beginning of a pattern that speaks to your own life, then like this video and subscribe to Ancient Path of Life. Leave a comment below. What old system, what inherited mindset, pattern or loyalty, do you believe God is calling people to leave today in order to walk fully in His promise? We read the comments, and that conversation is always worth having. And in the next episode, we will move from Abraham's obedience to another life in Scripture, a man greatly gifted, but deeply ungoverned. Because Abraham shows us what happens when a man allows God to reorder his life. But another story will show us what happens when divine gift is not matched with discipline, wisdom and inner government. Until then, keep walking the ancient path. So here is the question I want to leave with you: what is one old system, mindset or pattern that a person may need to leave in order to walk fully in God's promise? Write it in the comments. Because sometimes, naming the thing is the beginning of leaving it.